Hey guys, Dr. Stitzel here. So today we're going to do price ceilings and floors. Let's start with the price ceiling. A price ceiling is a legally determined maximum price that a seller may charge. So by government edict, the price is fixed. It can go no higher. A really common example, or probably the most well-known example, is rent control. So you might have heard of this in some larger cities, most notably New York City. There's a maximum price that you can charge to rent out an apartment. And so they say, well, this is the maximum price you can charge. That's an example of a price ceiling. All right, so let's take a look at what this would look like. So we have a downward sloping demand curve. We have an upward sloping supply curve. Just our normal market setup. So for a price ceiling to be effective, you have to remember that you want to hold the price below the equilibrium situation, right? So we can't have a situation where the ceiling is above equilibrium, because in that case, the price will just be the equilibrium price. So suppose the government comes in and says, here's our market price. Well, normally this would be the price, right? So we'll say like the free market price or the natural equilibrium. And that would cause us to have, again, a free market outcome. In this scenario, though, we're artificially holding the price too low. So this conversation is going to sound very familiar to what we had all the way back when we did the equilibrium video, but that'll be a good thing. So if the price is this, then how much do consumers want? Well, they want this much. At that low price, they're going to want more than they would at the normal price that is made. That would be the outcome of a market, right? And so the quantity demanded would be up here. In the same way, if the price is held much lower, suppliers want to make less of it available. Quantity supplied. Okay, so again, we have that gap there. As you remember, this is what we call a shortage. And a shortage means people want more than is made available. All right, so the outcome then is consumers who value the good more than it costs to produce miss out on the good. So remember that in these kind of cases, whatever that lower quantity is, so by lowering the price, you made less of it become available, because for a transaction to happen, you have to have mutually beneficial exchange. To have exchange, you need two parties to the exchange. So notice, though, that I'm actually making quite a bit stronger point than just, oh, there's this shortage between here and here, right? But actually, this gap right here between what the market, the equilibrium outcome would have been, and this is the amount that actually ends up happening to be exchanged, means there were a fixed number of goods that should have been produced and consumed. That's this quantity. That's the coming from this equilibrium that is not because of ceiling. Okay, so the shortage isn't just sort of a hypothetical thing, but it's saying people would really have benefited from consuming this good, and they were willing to pay more, but because we have this price ceiling, those transactions never happen. So notice that price ceilings make both consumers and producers worse off. Let's think a little bit about the rent control case, right? In the rent control case, you have a situation where the provision, the supply of rental apartments is sort of fixed, right? But actually the quality of rental apartments is quite varied. And so what you see, if you read stories about people who live in New York City, especially in rent-controlled areas, is that the quality of these apartments just deteriorates and deteriorates and deteriorates. So bear in mind that the supply effect that would happen here is actually very complex. It's actually quite, it has many dimensions. Okay, next let's take a look at price floors. So in the same way that a price ceiling is a legally determined maximum price, now a floor is a legally determined minimum price. So it's the least that a seller may receive in exchange for a good. Of course, the most interesting example of this is minimum wage. minimum wage, right? So that's actually happening in the labor market. And so you have the least that a seller, in this case, bear in mind that in the labor market, the seller is the employee, right? The employer is buying the labor from the employee. The least that they can receive is $7.25, or probably in the next few years, we're going to have $15 minimum wage. Okay, so let's do the same thing that we did before and analyze what is the impact of having a situation where we have a price floor. And I'll take this example and go, actually, let me go back really quickly, because I think there's actually an evocative example here that can help us think about these things. We want to remember a price ceiling tries to hold things down. So we think of our ceiling keeping the balloon down. So I want to do the same thing here, which is why I remembered to do that, is we want to do a price floor. So for a price floor to be what's called effective or binding, it has to be above what the price would be because it's trying to hold things up, just like the floor that you're standing on now. Okay, so what would be the market outcome? The market outcome would normally have been this. So there's our market outcome. Here's what would have been our market price, right? And we can do the exact same analysis. If the price is held artificially high, what happens? Well, people end up wanting to provide quite a bit more of the good, but people who want to consume the good end up wanting much less of it because the price is artificially too high. Again, you remember this idea. This is called surplus. It's this gap here. Okay, so this is important though because this has a correlated but sort of very interesting idea here, which is not just that consumers would benefit from more of these things being produced. Now we have the opposite problem. Inputs are wasted as goods and services that consumers do not want. They're not highly valued enough, are produced, and therefore not consumed. Right? So what would be an example of this in the labor market? This would be making yourself available to get a job, and then not enough jobs are out there. Maybe it's education, maybe it's training, maybe it's just time spent preparing to get the things, or even real costs prepared to get the things that you would want to have in order that you could complete a job. A really good example of this in a minimum wage case might be getting a car or something like that you would need to transport you back and forth to work. That might be something you might not have done if you weren't trying to get a particular job. Okay, so again, the same kind of logic applies here. So how many, if we're thinking about the labor market, how many jobs end up being filled? It's this many when it would have been this many, right? So we lose the difference between the jobs that would have happened under a market outcome and instead happen under the price ceiling. So we have very strong theoretical reasons to talk about the unemployment, or actually, right, labor markets are complex. And this harkens all the way back to most of what you learn in Econ 101 is right. People say, well, the world is really complex, and so you can't use economic principles to understand these things. Of course you can. But we also do want to acknowledge that these things are complex. One of the complexities in this case is that instead of strictly unemployment, when minimum wage, we would expect the effect to be disemployment. And we actually do see this in the literature. The other video that you're going to study this week is going to be the podcast interview I did with Rex Piesky. And in there, I actually talk about the economic research. And the research shows that while the wages are higher, actually that is a prediction of minimum wage, is that the prevailing market price is actually held up by the price floor, but you see a disemployment effect. And so we actually find this borne out in the academic research as well. So a lot more on this to come. So our next question that we want to turn to is, why is it that price ceilings and floors get used? And the answer is public choice reasons. This is what we call like a do something disease, right? We can think of lots of good examples of this where we feel like here's a problem, we would like to have it solved, we must do something. And often those some things are to say, well, the price is too high or too low. So by government mandate, we'll institute a price ceiling or a price floor. At this point, I have to remind you, of course, that intentions are not results, because simple systems, like a government rule, can't govern complex systems like a labor market or like the market for rental houses in New York City. Those are very complex systems that are emergent, right? They're socially ordered in an emergent way. And those unintended consequences, because intentions are not results, are going to be either shortages or surpluses, and those have real and lasting consequences for the people involved in those markets.